Welcome to Betrayed Hearts Chronicles. The rain tapped against my office window, each droplet streaking down like a teardrop from the city's gray face. It was late, too late for clients, too early to head home. I leaned back in my worn leather chair, the scent of stale coffee and old paper filling the room, and stared at the half-finished case file on my desk. Divorce, infidelity, hidden bank accounts, the same tired pattern, recycled over and over in people's lives. It's funny, though, you never think you'll be the subject of your own investigation. My name's Alex Carter. I've been a private investigator for almost 15 years, a career that started out with ideals of justice and truth and devolved into chasing cheating spouses and tracking down deadbeat dads. Still, the work paid the bills and kept my mind sharp. But that night, as I glanced at the clock, I was counting down the minutes until I could see Claire. Claire had been my wife for 8 years. When we first met, I was still green in the business, taking on any case I could to make ends meet. She was a paralegal, sharp-witted and beautiful in a way that made the world fade when she walked into a room. She had this warmth about her that made strangers spill their life stories without meaning to, but her fire was what kept me hooked. "You're staring again," she'd say, rolling her eyes, but her lips would curl into that half-smile that only she could pull off. Back then, it felt like we could take on the world. But somewhere along the line, things shifted. Claire had been restless lately. She'd started volunteering for more projects at work and joining networking events that didn't end until midnight. She'd always been ambitious, but this was different, a kind of drive I didn't recognize. I wanted to be happy for her, to believe it was just her career taking off, but there was a part of me that couldn't shake the feeling that I was being shut out. When I got home that night, the house was quiet. Claire's car was still in the driveway, but the lights were dimmed, and her shoes were neatly placed by the door. I hung up my coat and wandered into the kitchen, where I found her sitting at the table, a glass of red wine in her hand. "Hey," I said, dropping my keys onto the counter. "Everything okay?" She looked up, startled, as though she hadn't heard me come in. "Yeah," she said quickly, flashing me a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Long day at work. I'm just unwinding." I studied her for a moment, noting the faint smudge of mascara beneath her eyes and the tension in her shoulders. She was wearing a blouse I didn't recognize, silky and low-cut, the kind of thing she'd usually reserve for special occasions. "You look nice," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "Thanks." She glanced at her watch and then back at me. "How was your day?" Same old, I replied. "Caught a guy who's been skimming money from his business partner. Not the most exciting case, but it'll keep the lights on." She nodded absently, her gaze drifting toward the window. The rain had picked up, a steady drumming that filled the silence between us. I wanted to ask her where she'd been, why she seemed so distant lately, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I poured myself a drink and sat across from her, watching as she swirled her wine in slow circles. "Are you sure everything's okay?" I asked again, softer this time. Claire's eyes flicked to mine, and for a moment, I thought she might tell me. But then she smiled and shook her head. "I'm fine, Alex. Really. You worry too much." Maybe I did. After all, I'd built a career out of seeing red flags where others saw nothing. But when it came to Claire, I'd always tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. She wasn't like my clients, she was better than that. At least, that's what I told myself as we climbed into bed that night. Her back turned to me as the sound of rain lulled us both into uneasy sleep. The next morning, she was gone before I woke up. A note on the kitchen counter said she'd had an early meeting downtown and didn't want to wake me. I stared at her handwriting, neat and precise, and felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. Loneliness? Doubt? I shook it off and got ready for work, burying myself in the details of a new case to keep my mind from wandering. That evening, I decided to surprise her. I left the office early and stopped by her favorite bakery to pick up a box of pastries. As I drove home, the setting sun cast long shadows across the streets, the city bathed in a golden haze. I felt a flicker of optimism, a hope that maybe we could reconnect. But when I walked through the door, Claire wasn't there. Her shoes were gone, and there was no note this time. I checked my phone, but there were no missed calls or messages. I tried not to let my mind jump to conclusions, but the silence felt heavy, oppressive. Setting the pastries on the counter, I sat down and stared at my phone, debating whether to call her. Instead, I opened my laptop and began reviewing the day's case files. Hours passed. The clock ticked closer to midnight, and still, there was no sign of her. Finally, just as I was about to call, the sound of the front door opening made me sit up. Claire walked in, her hair slightly damp and her cheeks flushed. "Sorry I'm late," she said, setting her bag down. "The meeting ran long, and then some of us went out for drinks." "You could have called," I said, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. She sighed and ran a hand through her hair. "I didn't realize how late it had gotten. It won't happen again." But it did. Over the next few weeks, her absences grew more frequent, and her excuses became harder to believe. The warmth between us seemed to dim, replaced by a quiet tension that neither of us acknowledged. One night, as I sat alone in my office, the thought struck me like a thunderclap. What if she was hiding something? The idea felt like a betrayal in itself, but I couldn't shake it. For the first time in our marriage, I considered turning my skills inward, using the tools of my trade to uncover the truth about my own wife. I stared at the file I'd been working on, the face of a cheating husband staring back at me from a grainy photo. Could I do it? Could I cross that line? The answer, I realized, was already there. I reached for my notebook and began to plan. Claire had been the love of my life, but something had changed. And whether I liked it or not, I was going to find out what it was. I was a man trained to notice the details, the subtle glance, the hesitation in a voice, the way a hand lingers just a fraction of a second longer than necessary. My work demanded that level of observation. But as I began to watch Claire more closely, I realized how blind I'd been in my own home. It started innocuously enough. Little things. The way her phone was suddenly always face down on the counter. The faint smell of cologne on her blouse that wasn't mine. She'd laugh at texts she didn't share and bristle when I asked casual questions about her day. None of it was overtly damning, but my gut told me something was off. Claire was good at compartmentalizing. I'd seen her do it with her work, keeping her emotions in check even in the face of chaos. But now that wall felt insurmountable. I found myself replaying our conversations, dissecting her words for hidden meanings. At night, I'd lie awake beside her, straining to hear if her breathing shifted when she thought I was asleep. One evening, as I sat in my office reviewing case files, I decided to follow her. I told myself it was only to ease my suspicions, to confirm that I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew I was crossing a line. A part of me wanted to believe she'd catch me, that she'd confront me and call me paranoid. Then I'd have proof I was wrong. Instead, I found myself parked 2 blocks from a downtown wine bar, watching her through the windshield. She was inside, seated at a corner table, laughing with someone I didn't recognize. A man. He was polished in a way I'd never been, his suit tailored and his hair perfectly styled. They leaned in close as they talked, her hand brushing his as she reached for her glass. The gesture was fleeting, but it sent a jolt through me like an electric shock. It wasn't the touch of strangers. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, as I tried to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside me. Anger, jealousy, hurt. They all fought for dominance. But overriding them all was a cold, calculating voice that urged me to stay rational. If I confronted her now, she'd deny it. I needed proof. The next day, I installed a GPS tracker on her car. It was a simple device, one I'd used countless times in my work. It slid discreetly beneath the rear bumper, nearly invisible. I told myself it was a precaution, a way to confirm her story when she said she'd be working late or meeting with colleagues. But as I stood in the driveway, the weight of what I was doing pressed down on me. This was my wife, the woman I'd vowed to trust, to love through anything. And yet, here I was treating her like a suspect. Part of me hated myself for it, but the other part knew I couldn't stop. Over the next week, the tracker revealed patterns. Her usual routes to work and home were interspersed with detours to unfamiliar addresses. A boutique hotel on the outskirts of the city. a park where she'd sit in her car for an hour before driving away. I watched the dots on the map like a hawk, each movement feeding my obsession. When she was home, I studied her more closely. Her laughter seemed forced, her smiles rehearsed. I'd catch her staring at her phone, her lips curving into a small, private smile. She'd never done that before. At night, she turned away from me in bed, her body a distant island I couldn't reach. The first time I saw them together outside the wine bar, it felt surreal. They were at the park, the one where she'd often linger. He leaned against her car, his posture relaxed, while she stood in front of him, her arms crossed but her body language open. They were close, too close. When he reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, I felt my stomach twist. I wanted to burst out of my own skin, to march over there and demand an explanation. But I stayed frozen in my own car, my fists clenched on my lap. I'd always prided myself on staying calm under pressure, but this was different. This was Claire. Instead, I took photos. The camera's shutter sounded deafening in the quiet of the car, but neither of them noticed. I captured every touch, every glance, every moment that confirmed what I'd already begun to suspect. Back at home, I printed the photos and spread them out on my desk, each one a dagger to my heart. There was no denying it now. Claire was having an affair. That night, she came home late again, the faint scent of his cologne clinging to her clothes. I forced myself to act normal, to hide the storm raging inside me. She kissed me on the cheek, a perfunctory gesture that felt more like an obligation than affection, and disappeared into the bathroom. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the closed door. The weight of what I'd discovered pressed down on me, suffocating. I thought of confronting her, of shoving the photos in her face and demanding answers. But the rational part of me held back. I needed to understand why, to know if there was still a chance to salvage what we had. For now, I'd keep my cards close. But the line between investigator and husband had blurred, and I wasn't sure if I'd ever be able to cross back. By the time the weekend arrived, I had pieced together enough to paint a damning picture. Claire's meetings, the wine bar, the boutique hotel. It all formed a pattern that I couldn't ignore. The evidence was overwhelming, but what gnawed at me most was the intimacy of it all. It wasn't just sex. It was connection, laughter, touches, the kind of moments that once belonged to us. That Saturday, she left the house around noon. She said she was meeting a friend for lunch. Her tone was light, casual, and she kissed me on the cheek before walking out the door. My stomach churned as I watched her drive away, the GPS tracker updating her location in real time. I followed her at a distance, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to stay inconspicuous. It felt like any other surveillance job, but the stakes were so much higher. Every turn she took, every stop she made, was a twist of the knife. Eventually, she parked near the riverfront, where a row of restaurants overlooked the water. I pulled into a spot a few blocks away and watched as she stepped out of the car. She dressed simply but elegantly. A summer dress that clung to her in all the right places, paired with heels that made her legs look longer. My pulse quickened, a mixture of anger and heartbreak flooding my veins. She walked into a small bistro with outdoor seating, and moments later he appeared. The same man I'd seen at the wine bar and the park. He greeted her with a smile that was almost predatory in its charm, leaning in to kiss her cheek. My stomach twisted as she smiled back, her face lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in months. They took a table by the window, giving me a clear view from my vantage point across the street. I watched as they talked, their conversation animated and easy. Claire laughed at something he said, her hand brushing his arm as if it were the most natural thing in the world. It was a scene out of a romantic comedy, except I was the one sitting in the shadows, my chest tightening with every passing second. I pulled out my camera, the telephoto lens bringing them into sharp focus. It felt sickeningly voyeuristic, but I needed the proof. The shutter clicked softly as I captured the way she leaned toward him, the way he reached across the table to take her hand. Halfway through the meal, he stood and gestured toward the door. Claire followed, her face alight with curiosity. I ducked lower in my seat as they stepped outside, my heart hammering as I watched them walk toward the riverbank. The river glinted in the afternoon sun, a picturesque backdrop for the scene unfolding before me. They strolled side by side, their bodies close but not quite touching. I could see the tension in her, the way her shoulders lifted slightly, her steps lighter than usual. She was nervous but excited. I'd seen that look before, years ago when we'd first started dating. He said something that made her laugh, and then he stopped walking. Turning to face her, he reached out and brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. The gesture was tender, almost reverent, and it made my blood boil. She didn't pull away. Instead, she looked up at him with a vulnerability that cut me to my core. Before I could process what was happening, he leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't rushed or frantic. It was slow, deliberate, the kind of kiss that spoke of familiarity and longing. She melted into him, her hands resting on his chest as the world seemed to blur around them. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I wanted to storm out of the car, to rip them apart and demand an explanation. But I stayed rooted in place, the weight of my own paralysis pressing down on me. This wasn't just a betrayal of our vows. It was a betrayal of everything we'd built together. They parted after the kiss, their faces inches apart as they exchanged quiet words I couldn't hear. Then they turned and began walking back toward the bistro, their hands brushing occasionally as if testing the waters of a new boundary. I took more photos, each one a dagger to my heart. When they reached the parking lot, he opened her car door for her, and she slipped inside with a smile. He lingered for a moment, watching her drive away before heading to his own car. I waited until he was gone before starting my engine. My hands trembled as I gripped the wheel, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. How long had this been going on? What had I done to drive her into his arms? And most haunting of all, was there any way to come back from this? That night, Claire came home late. She apologized for losing track of time, blaming her friend for keeping her longer than expected. I nodded, biting back the urge to confront her then and there. The photos sat on my desk upstairs, undeniable proof of her betrayal. But I wasn't ready to show my hand. Instead, I watched her as she moved around the kitchen, humming softly to herself. She seemed lighter, happier. And for the first time in weeks, she came to bed early, curling up beside me as if nothing had changed. I lay awake long after she'd fallen asleep, the weight of the day pressing down on me. The kiss replayed in my mind on an endless loop, each detail seared into my memory. I'd uncovered the truth, but it felt like I'd lost so much more in the process. Tomorrow I'd decide what to do. For now, I lay there in the dark, the woman I loved sleeping peacefully beside me, and wondered how everything had gone so wrong. The morning after the kiss I witnessed, I woke with a heaviness that felt like it had seeped into my bones. Claire moved around the kitchen with an air of casual ease, humming softly to herself as she poured coffee and flipped through her phone. The sight of her, so at peace, so oblivious to the storm brewing inside me, stung worse than any of the evidence I'd gathered. "Any plans for today?" she asked, her voice light and breezy. I forced a smile. "Just a few errands." "You?" "A work meeting around noon, and then I might grab a drink with Lily," she said, mentioning her friend, or at least the name she often used as an alibi. I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral. The GPS tracker had already shown me her plans. She wouldn't be meeting Lily. She'd be meeting him. At 11:30, she left the house, dressed in a fitted blouse and pencil skirt that clung to her curves. She'd styled her hair in loose waves, the kind of effort she rarely made when we were just running errands or having dinner at home. I waited until her car disappeared down the street before grabbing my keys and following at a safe distance. The GPS led me to the boutique hotel again. She parked and walked inside without hesitation, her heels clicking against the pavement with a confidence that made my chest tighten. I pulled into a spot a few cars away and sat there, my mind racing as I tried to decide what to do. Every instinct screamed at me to confront her, to barge into that hotel and end this charade. But I couldn't. Not yet. I needed to see it through to understand the full extent of her betrayal. The minutes dragged as I waited in the car, each second a weight pressing down on my chest. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I stepped out and walked toward the hotel, my heart pounding in my ears. The lobby was quiet, the receptionist barely glancing up as I entered. I scanned the room, my eyes landing on the elevator at the far end. I knew I was crossing a line, but the thought of her with him in that hotel room drove me forward. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the 3rd floor, my pulse quickening with every floor I ascended. The hallway was silent, the thick carpet muffling my footsteps as I approached the room number I'd seen her enter in the tracker logs before. My breath hitched as I reached the door, a faint murmur of voices filtering through the wood. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Intimate, familiar. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my hand hovering over the door. Part of me wanted to knock, to demand answers, but the other part held back, paralyzed by fear of what I might see. Eventually, I turned and walked away, each step feeling heavier than the last. I returned to my car and waited. Nearly 2 hours passed before she emerged from the hotel, her hair slightly tousled and a faint flush on her cheeks. He followed a few steps behind her, his hand brushing against the small of her back as they walked to their cars. My stomach churned as I watched her smile at him, the kind of smile she used to reserve for me. She climbed into her car and drove away, leaving him standing there with a satisfied smirk. That night she came home late again. She slipped into the house quietly, as if trying not to wake me, but I was already awake, sitting in the darkened living room. "Hey!" she said, startled when she saw me. "You're up late." "Couldn't sleep?" I replied, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. She hesitated for a moment, then walked over and kissed me on the forehead. "I'm going to shower. Long day." I watched her walk away, the sound of her heels clicking against the hardwood floor echoing in my ears. The door to the bathroom clicked shut, and moments later, I heard the rush of water from the shower. I sat there in the silence, the weight of the day pressing down on me like a tidal wave. My mind raced with images of her and him in that hotel room, the intimacy they'd shared. I'd spent years uncovering secrets for other people, but nothing had prepared me for this. When she came to bed that night, she curled up beside me, her body warm and soft against mine. It felt like a cruel irony, the closeness I'd longed for now tainted by the knowledge of her betrayal. As she drifted off to sleep, I stared at the ceiling, my mind a whirlwind of anger, hurt, and questions I didn't know how to answer. The line between investigator and husband had blurred, and I was no closer to finding a way back. Days turned into weeks, and the pattern became uncomfortably clear. Claire's absences, once sporadic and easy to dismiss, grew consistent. She would leave under the guise of work meetings or social outings, always with an excuse that seemed plausible but never quite added up. The tracker on her car and the photos on my desk told the real story, a story that unfolded with excruciating predictability. She and the man, whose name I eventually learned was Daniel, met almost twice a week. Always at the same places, the boutique hotel, the wine bar, the park by the river. It wasn't just about the physical affair anymore. It was the routine, the rhythm they had fallen into. They acted like a couple carving out their own private world, separate from mine. Every time I followed her, a part of me hoped I'd be proven wrong, that this time it would really be a work meeting or a casual lunch with a friend. But each time, I ended up parked at a distance, watching as she slipped further away from me. One Thursday evening, she told me she'd be working late again. By then, I had stopped asking for details. I'd grown tired of the lies. Instead, I watched her leave and then followed, my chest tightening as her car took the familiar route to the riverfront. She parked near the wine bar, and Daniel's car pulled in minutes later. They greeted each other with a kiss, unhurried and practiced, as if they had done this 100 times before. This time, they didn't go inside. They strolled along the riverbank, hand in hand, their conversation punctuated by laughter. I stayed in my car, the telephoto lens of my camera capturing every moment. The way her face lit up when she looked at him, the way his hand lingered on the small of her back. These were gestures I'd once taken for granted. Now they felt like knives twisting in my chest. By the time they left, it was nearly midnight. She came home an hour later, her excuse preloaded and delivered with a practiced ease that made my stomach churn. "The meeting ran long," she said, kicking off her heels and setting her bag down by the door. "You didn't have to wait up." "I wasn't waiting," I lied. She hesitated, her eyes searching mine for a moment before she turned away. "I'm going to take a shower." As the bathroom door clicked shut, I sat in the darkened living room, the photos I'd taken earlier that evening spread out on the coffee table in front of me. My hands trembled as I shuffled through them, each image a stark reminder of how far we'd fallen. The next morning, Claire left early for work, her usual cheerful demeanor carefully intact. I spent the day poring over the evidence I'd collected, trying to piece together what to do next. Confronting her felt inevitable, but the timing had to be right. I needed to understand her motivations, to hear her say the words out loud, even if they ripped me apart. My resolve hardened that afternoon when I received a notification from the tracker. She was on the move again, this time heading to a new location, a secluded cabin in the woods just outside the city. I followed her, my pulse racing as I navigated the winding roads that led to the cabin. By the time I arrived, her car was already parked outside, Daniel's SUV beside it. I stayed hidden among the trees, my camera trained on the cabin as they disappeared inside. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as I waited, the muffled sounds of their laughter occasionally drifting through the air. My mind conjured images of what was happening inside, each one more torturous than the last. When they finally emerged, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the clearing. Claire's hair was tousled, her cheeks flushed, and her blouse slightly wrinkled. Daniel's hand rested possessively on her waist as they walked to their cars, sharing a lingering kiss before parting ways. I stayed until they were both gone, the silence of the woods pressing down on me like a physical weight. The cabin stood empty now, but the echoes of their betrayal lingered. I took a deep breath, my hands tightening into fists as I turned back to my car. That night, Claire came home with a takeout bag in hand, her smile as bright as ever. She set the food on the table and kissed my cheek, her affection feeling like a cruel mockery of what I'd seen earlier. "Thought we could have dinner together for a change," she said, her tone light. I nodded, swallowing the anger that threatened to spill over. "Sounds good." As we ate, I watched her closely, searching for any sign of guilt or hesitation. But Claire was a master of masks, and tonight she wore hers flawlessly. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine curiosity. "Busy," I replied. "Yours?" "The usual," she said with a shrug. "Meetings, paperwork, the never-ending grind." I forced a smile, nodding along to her lies. The truth sat heavy in my chest, threatening to consume me. But I wasn't ready to confront her yet. Not until I knew why. Not until I understood what had driven her into another man's arms. As we cleared the table and settled onto the couch, I felt the distance between us more acutely than ever. She leaned against me, her head resting on my shoulder, and for a brief moment, it almost felt real. But the weight of her betrayal hung between us, an unspoken truth that neither of us dared acknowledge. I stared at the flickering light of the television, my mind already racing ahead to what I needed to do next. The regular meetings had laid bare the depth of her affair, but there was still so much I didn't know. And until I had all the answers, I would keep playing my part, even as it tore me apart from the inside. The days blurred together as my investigation continued, but the tension in the air grew sharper, cutting through the facade Claire and I maintained at home. Each time she left, each meeting with Daniel, was another thread unraveling the fabric of our marriage. But now, the stakes were rising, and the risks Claire was taking became impossible to ignore. It started subtly. She stopped being as cautious with her explanations. Once, she claimed to be at a work event, but the photos I had from that evening, of her and Daniel at a secluded outdoor concert, said otherwise. Another time, she called to say she'd be working late, but her GPS tracker placed her at a private beach house on the outskirts of town. It was as if the thrill of the affair was dulling her need for discretion. I watched her spiral with a mixture of anger and fascination. Every lie she told, Every excuse she made was another step closer to exposure. And yet, she seemed oblivious, or perhaps too consumed by her infatuation to care. But the real turning point came one night when her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She was upstairs showering, and for a moment, I just stared at the glowing screen. It was a text from Daniel. "Can't stop thinking about you. Meet me tomorrow. Usual spot." The message was a punch to the gut, a stark reminder of everything I'd uncovered. But it also presented an opportunity. If they were growing reckless, it was only a matter of time before their affair spilled into our world. The next evening, Claire dressed in a way that made my stomach twist. A sleek black dress, her hair styled in loose waves, and just a hint of perfume. Subtle but intoxicating. "You look nice," I said, forcing a smile as she grabbed her purse. "Thanks," she replied, her tone light. "It's just a work dinner." The lie rolled off her tongue so easily that it took everything in me not to react. Instead, I nodded, watching as she walked out the door, my chest tightening with every step she took. I waited 5 minutes before grabbing my keys and following. The tracker led me downtown, to a high-end restaurant I'd never seen her visit before. I parked a block away and walked to the corner, blending into the shadows as I watched her and Daniel through the window. They sat at a small, candlelit table near the back, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of the flames. She was laughing, her hand brushing his as they talked. It was almost easy to forget the betrayal in those moments. They looked like any other couple out on a romantic date. But then Daniel reached across the table, his fingers curling around hers, and the image shattered. What happened next felt like a blur. I wasn't sure if it was adrenaline or sheer fury, but I found myself walking into the restaurant, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might drown out the sound of my own footsteps. The hostess looked up, startled, as I strode past her and toward their table. Claire's laughter died the moment she saw me. Her face went pale, her eyes widening in shock as I stood there, my hands clenched at my sides. Daniel, to his credit, didn't flinch. He leaned back in his chair, a calm, almost smug expression on his face as he regarded me. "Alex," Claire stammered, her voice trembling, "what are you doing here?" I stared at her, my jaw tight. "I could ask you the same thing." For a moment, the table fell silent, the tension crackling like static electricity. Other diners glanced our way, their conversations faltering as they sensed the confrontation brewing. Daniel was the first to break the silence. "Maybe we should step outside," he said, his tone maddeningly composed. "Stay out of this?" I snapped, my gaze never leaving Claire's. "How long, Claire? How long has this been going on?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her silence was all the confirmation I needed. The betrayal I'd been uncovering for weeks now stood before me, laid bare in the flickering candlelight. We left the restaurant in silence. Claire's footsteps hurried as she followed me to the car. Daniel didn't try to stop us, but I could feel his eyes on my back as we walked away. The ride home was tense, the air between us thick with unspoken words. When we finally stepped into the house, the dam broke. "How could you?" I demanded, my voice trembling with anger. "How could you do this to us?" "Alex, she began, but I cut her off. "Don't lie to me, Claire. Not anymore. I know everything." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she sank into the couch, her face buried in her hands. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered. It got out of control." I stared at her, the woman I'd loved and trusted more than anyone in the world, and felt something inside me shatter. The risk she'd taken, the lies she'd told, it wasn't just betrayal. It was a complete disregard for everything we'd built together. "Do you love him?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. For a moment, she hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything I needed to know. That night, I slept in the guest room, the weight of her silence pressing down on me like a stone. The confrontation had brought the affair into the open, but it hadn't answered the questions that haunted me. Why had she done it? And more importantly, where did we go from here? As I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The risks she'd taken, the lies she'd told, they were the prelude to something far more dangerous. And as much as I wanted to walk away, I knew I couldn't. Not yet. Not until I understood the full scope of what she'd dragged us into. The days that followed our confrontation were a fragile, awkward dance around the truth. Claire moved through the house like a ghost, her face pale, her movements mechanical. I alternated between silence and carefully worded questions, hoping to untangle the web of lies she had spun. But every answer led to more questions, more doubts, more anger. One evening, a week after the restaurant, she approached me in the living room. Her hands were trembling as she held out her phone. The screen lit up with a message thread. "You need to see this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, my mind racing with possibilities. Slowly, I took the phone and began to read. The messages were from Daniel, and they painted a picture far more sinister than I had imagined. What started as flirtation and intimacy had spiraled into manipulation. He wasn't just her lover. He was leveraging their relationship for something darker. "Daniel, you don't want Alex finding out everything, do you? I know you've told him bits and pieces, but if he knew the whole truth, well, that might make things messy. Claire, please don't do this. I'll figure something out." "Daniel, good, because if you don't, I will. And trust me, he'll believe me before he believes you." I looked up at her, my jaw tight. "What is this?" She sank onto the couch, her head in her hands. "It started as an affair," she admitted. I was lonely, Alex. I thought he understood me, that he cared. But it didn't take long for him to show his true colors. He started asking for things, money, favors. And when I tried to pull away, he threatened to tell you everything. "Why didn't you?" I asked, my voice a mix of anger and disbelief. "Why didn't you come to me?" "Because I was scared," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I thought I could handle it, that I could keep it from affecting us. But I was wrong. I was so wrong." Her confession hit me like a freight train. The betrayal, the lies, the deceit. It was all there, but now it was tangled up in something far more dangerous. Daniel wasn't just a lover. He was a predator, using Claire's guilt and fear to manipulate her. And by extension, he was manipulating me. I spent the next few hours poring over the messages, piecing together the timeline of their relationship. The more I read, the more the picture came into focus. Daniel had inserted himself into her life, exploiting her vulnerabilities until she felt trapped. And now, his demands were escalating. The breaking point came 2 days later when I received an unmarked envelope in the mail. Inside was a single photo of Claire and Daniel, taken at the boutique hotel. Attached was a note scrawled in jagged handwriting. "You're not as good at watching as you think. Time to pay up or this goes public." My hands shook as I read the note, the implications sinking in. This wasn't just about Claire anymore. Daniel was targeting me now, trying to use my reputation, my career as leverage. The lines between personal and professional had blurred, and I was caught in the crossfire. That night, Claire and I sat at the kitchen table, the envelope and its contents spread out between us. "We can't keep playing his game," I said. "What choice do we have?" she asked, her voice trembling. "If we don't, he'll ruin us." "No," I said firmly. "He won't, because we're going to take control of this." "How?" I didn't have an answer yet, but I knew one thing for certain. Daniel had underestimated me. He thought he could manipulate us, that he held all the cards. But he didn't know who he was dealing with. The next morning, I started making calls. Contacts I hadn't spoken to in years. Favors I'd never thought I'd have to call in. Surveillance, background checks, anything that could give me an edge. If Daniel wanted a game, I was going to beat him at it. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. The betrayal still burned, the wound still fresh, but now there was something else driving me. The need to protect what little remained of my life. Claire had made mistakes, terrible ones, but now she was part of the solution. And together we would bring Daniel down. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat at my desk, a plan beginning to take shape. Daniel thought he was in control, but he had no idea what I was capable of. This wasn't just about exposing him or ending the affair. This was about reclaiming my life, my marriage, and my sense of self. And I would stop at nothing to make it happen. The confrontation was inevitable, and I knew it wouldn't be clean. Daniel had spent weeks tightening his grip, but he underestimated just how far I was willing to go to dismantle his hold over Claire and me. The plan was risky, and there were no guarantees, but the alternative, letting him win, wasn't an option. It started with a meeting at a quiet diner on the outskirts of town. I'd arranged for Daniel to meet me there, using a message sent from Claire's phone. The bait was simple: a promise of money to ensure his silence. When he arrived, he didn't look surprised to see me instead of her. "Alex," he said with a smirk as he slid into the booth across from me. "Didn't expect you to handle this personally." "How noble." I kept my expression neutral, my hands folded on the table. "Let's cut to the chase. How much is it going to take for you to disappear?" He leaned back, his smirk widening. "It's not just about money, you know. This is about power. Control. I hold all the cards here." "You think you do?" I said, my voice calm. "But you've made one critical mistake." "Oh, you targeted someone who knows how to dig." I slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of bank statements, emails, and photographs that painted a damning picture of Daniel's activities. Fraud, blackmail, and a string of affairs that extended far beyond Claire. His smirk faltered as he flipped through the documents. "Where did you get these?" "I'm very good at my job," I said. "And now you have a choice. You can walk away and leave us alone, or I take this to the police, the press, and everyone else who might be interested." His jaw tightened, but he recovered quickly, leaning forward with a glare. "You think you can scare me?" I met his gaze, my voice steady. "I'm not trying to scare you. I'm giving you a way out. Take it or lose everything." For a moment, he didn't move, the tension between us thick enough to cut. Then, without a word, he stood, tossed the folder onto the table, and walked out. I exhaled, the adrenaline coursing through me as I watched him leave. It wasn't over yet, but it was a start. Claire was waiting for me when I got home. She looked pale, her hands wringing nervously as I stepped through the door. "Did it work?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "For now," I said. "But it's not a permanent solution." Her shoulders slumped, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Alex, for everything." I wanted to comfort her, to tell her we could fix this. But the words wouldn't come. The betrayal was still too raw, the damage too deep. "We need to talk," I said, my voice firm but not unkind. "About what happens next." She nodded, wiping her eyes as we sat down at the kitchen table. For hours we talked. About the affair, about Daniel, about the years of distance and silence that had led us here. It was painful, raw, and honest in a way we hadn't been in years. But it wasn't enough. The decision to divorce wasn't made lightly. We both knew it was the only path forward, but that didn't make it any easier. Claire moved out a week later, renting a small apartment downtown while we began the slow, grueling process of untangling our lives. The legal proceedings were straightforward, but the emotional toll was anything but. Every meeting with lawyers, every division of assets, felt like another blow, a reminder of what we'd lost. Friends and family tried to offer support, but their words felt hollow. Only Claire and I understood the depth of our failure. The final hearing took place on a gray, rainy morning. We sat side by side in the courtroom, our lawyers handling the details as we stared straight ahead. When the judge pronounced the marriage dissolved, Claire reached over and squeezed my hand. I didn't pull away. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Me too," I said, my throat tight. We walked out of the courthouse together, the rain soaking through our coats. For a moment, we stood there in silence, the weight of everything we'd endured pressing down on us. Then she turned and walked away, her figure fading into the mist as I stood rooted to the spot. In the months that followed, I threw myself into work, taking on cases that reminded me of why I'd become a private investigator in the first place. Helping others find the truth, even when it hurt, gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. As for Claire, we kept our distance, communicating only when necessary. I heard through mutual friends that she was seeing a therapist, trying to rebuild her life. I didn't ask for details. Some wounds were better left to heal in private. One evening, as I sat in my office reviewing a new case, I found myself staring at a photo on my desk. It was from years ago, taken on our honeymoon. We were smiling, our arms wrapped around each other as the ocean sparkled behind us. I felt a pang of sadness, but also a strange sense of peace. We'd loved each other once, deeply and completely, and even though that love had been twisted and broken, it had been real. Closing the file, I stood and walked to the window, the city lights stretching out before me. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, I felt ready to face it, alone. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.